The graves were not empty when they found them, and that was what made it worse, because something had gone down there. Something had opened the earth, taken what it needed, and then closed it again, as if nothing had happened. And when Ronan Vaughan reached the cemetery at the edge of the village, the ground looked undisturbed. At first glance, the rows of markers standing in place, the soil flat and packed as it should have been. But the villagers did not need to show him which graves had been touched. He saw it in the details. The slight sinking of the earth where it had been disturbed from below, the fine cracks running through the surface in uneven patterns that did not belong to weather or time, and the smell faint, but present something damp and wrong that rose from beneath the soil rather than from anything left above it. They said it started with animals. First, small things disappearing from the fields, then dogs, then one man buried 2 days before was found again. Not above ground, but halfway out of it. His body forced upward from below, the dirt packed into his mouth and eyes, his arms broken, as if he had tried to claw his way free. And Ronan did not ask more than that because the story had already told him enough. This was not something that hunted on the surface. This was something that moved beneath it, something that took what it wanted and returned the ground to silence. Afterward, he stepped between the rows, slowly his boots pressing into the soil, as his gaze moved across the graves, counting them, measuring the spacing, because creatures that moved like this left patterns, even when they tried not to. And what he saw was not random. The disturbed graves formed a rough line, not straight, but directional, leading toward the far end of the cemetery, where the ground dipped slightly toward the forest beyond. And that was where he went, following that line until the soil beneath his feet changed softer, less compact, as if it had been turned more recently. And he stopped there, crouching slightly, his hand brushing against the surface, and the earth shifted beneath his touch, not collapsing, not giving way, but moving just enough to confirm what he already knew. There were tunnels beneath this place, not open, not large, but enough for something to pass through, repeatedly without breaking the surface. A faint sound reached him, then low and distant, not from above, but from below. A slow scraping, followed by a dull, hollow thud, and Ronan's hand moved to the hilt of his blade, because that sound did not belong to anything natural. Not in this place, not at this depth. And he rose slowly, his eyes scanning the ground around him, because whatever made that sound would not stay hidden for long. Not now that he was standing directly above it. The soil shifted, then a small, uneven ripple moving outward from a point several steps away, the surface rising slightly before settling again, as if something beneath had pressed upward and then moved on. And Ronan stepped back, immediately creating distance, because standing over it, when it chose to surface, would leave him no room to react. The ripple came again, closer, now faster, the ground, lifting more noticeably this time. And then it broke the soil, splitting open in a sharp, uneven line as something forced its way up through it. Not with speed, not with a sudden strike, but with slow, deliberate pressure, the earth parting around it as if it had done this many times before. And the shape that emerged was wrong from the start. Not the size, not the form, but the way it moved its limbs, pushing through the soil, in segments, not all at once, as if it assembled itself as it rose. And when the head finally broke through, Ronan saw it clearly. The shape of something that had once been human, but altered beyond recognition. the jaw extended too far, the teeth broken and uneven, the skin coated in damp earth that clung to it like a second layer, and its eyes empty, not in the way of death, but in the way of something that no longer needed to see. The creature pulled itself fully. From the ground, then its body long and narrow, its limbs too thin for the strength they carried as it dragged itself forward, the dirt falling from it in clumps, and Ronan did not wait. He stepped in immediately, his blade cutting across its neck in a fast, controlled strike, the steel biting deep enough to sever what remained of its structure, and the creature collapsed instantly, its body going still, as if whatever held it together had been cut cleanly. And for a moment the cemetery returned to silence, the ground settling again, the surface smoothing as if nothing had happened, and Ronan exhaled slowly, because that was too easy, far too easy for something that had already taken multiple bodies from beneath the earth. And he stepped back again, his gaze moving across the graves, because now he understood this was not the thing he was hunting. This was what it used, the remains of what it had taken, shaped into something that could move above ground when needed, but not the source. The scraping sound came again, then deeper, this time louder and closer, and the ground beneath several graves shifted at once, the soil rising in multiple places, as if something larger moved beneath all of them at once, and Ronan Vorn tightened his grip on the blade, because whatever lived under this cemetery was not alone, not small, and not finished taking what it needed, and the real hunt had only just begun. The ground did not settle. After that, it continued to shift in slow, uneven waves beneath the graves, as if something moved through the tunnels below, with purpose rather than panic. And Ronan did not stand still over it again, because he had already seen how it rose, how it chose its point of emergence. And staying in one place would only make that choice easier, so he moved along the edge of the disturbed ground. His steps measured his gaze, fixed on the subtle changes in the soil, the places where it lifted slightly, before smoothing again, and what he saw confirmed it. This was not a single path, not a straight tunnel, but a network branching beneath the cemetery, connecting one grave to another, allowing whatever lived below to move freely, without breaking the surface until it chose to. And that meant the entire ground beneath him was unstable, not in structure, but in control. It belonged to something else. Now a dull scrape sounded again, then closer, followed by a heavier impact that shook the soil just enough to feel through his boots. And Ronan stopped, turning his head slightly toward the sound, because this time it was different, slower, deeper, as if something larger had shifted its weight beneath him. And then the ground split open, not directly in front of him, but to his side, the soil cracking in a jagged line as something forced its way upward again, and this time it did not rise in parts. It came through all at once, a mass of limbs and broken forms pushing against each other as they emerged, the shape wrong even before it cleared the earth. Several bodies fused together, not cleanly, not intentionally, but forced into a single structure. Arms twisted into support legs, bent at angles that held weight where they should not have been. And Ronan stepped back immediately, his blade already in motion as the thing dragged itself free of the ground, the sound of bone grinding against bone echoing faintly beneath the surface, as if more of it remained below, and he struck fast his blade, cutting through one of the outer limbs, severing it at the joint. But the creature did not slow. It adjusted the weight, shifting to the remaining limbs, the structure compensating instantly, as if the loss meant nothing. And it lunged toward him, low and heavy, its movement slower than the first one, but stronger. The mass behind it, carrying enough force to break him, if it connected. And Ronan moved to the side, letting it pass just short, before turning and driving his blade into the center of the mass, aiming not for flesh, but for whatever held it together. And the steel struck resistance. Not bone, not muscle, but something deeper. Something that resisted like packed earth rather than living tissue, and he pulled back, immediately stepping away, as the creature twisted its body in response, the limbs shifting out of alignment before snapping back into place. And that was when he understood. This was not a creature in the way the others had been. This was an extension, a tool made from what had been taken, shaped to move above ground, when needed but sustained by something below, something that remained hidden. The ground behind it shifted again, then a ripple moving outward from the opening it had emerged from, and another shape began to rise, smaller this time, less stable, its form collapsing slightly as it pushed through the soil. And Ronan did not wait. He stepped forward, cutting it down, before it could fully emerge, the blade severing what held it together, and the body falling back into the opening, as the earth partially closed around it. But even as it did, the larger one pressed forward again, its movement relentless, its limbs dragging across the ground as it tried to close the distance. And Ronan changed position again, stepping back toward the firmer ground between the graves, forcing it to follow, forcing it to move away from the opening it had come from. Because if he allowed it to remain near that point, more would come, more of these things rising from below, until the surface itself became a trap, and the creature followed without hesitation, its mass shifting unevenly as it dragged itself forward. And Ronan watched the way it moved, the way the limbs adjusted, not randomly, but in response to pressure from beneath, as if something guided it from below rather than from within. And that was the second truth. The things above ground were not independent. They were controlled, directed by whatever remained in the tunnels. And that meant cutting them down would not end this. It would only delay it. The real target remained beneath the surface, and he would have to reach it somehow. The creature lunged again. Then its weight, driving it forward in a heavy, uneven motion, and Ronan stepped in this time, instead of away, his blade striking downward into the central mass with more force than before, aiming to split it open to expose whatever held it together. And the steel bit deeper, this time, cutting through the outer layer and into something softer beneath. And the reaction was immediate, the entire structure collapsing inward as the limbs lost coordination, the weight shifting unevenly before the whole thing fell apart, the bodies separating where they had been forced together, the connection broken, and the remains slumping back toward the ground, where they lay, still no longer held by anything that mattered. And the cemetery fell quiet again for a moment, the ground no longer shifting the surface, still as if whatever moved beneath had paused. And Ronan exhaled slowly, because that pause was not the end. It was a change, a moment, where whatever controlled this adjusted to what had happened, and the silence did not last. The earth trembled again, then stronger this time, deeper. The movement spreading across multiple graves, at once the soil rising in several places, as if something larger moved beneath all of them at once. And Ronan Vorn tightened his grip on the blade, because now he understood the scale of it. This was not a creature that moved through the tunnels. This was something that filled them, something that used them as part of itself. And if he wanted to end this, he would have to go where it lived, where it fed, where it pulled the dead from the earth and turned them into tools. And that meant going below, where the ground itself belonged to it, and where there would be no open space to fight, only darkness, and whatever waited within it. Ronan did not wait for the ground to open again, because he had already seen enough to understand that anything he destroyed on the surface would be replaced, and the source remained below. So he moved toward the nearest split in the earth, where one of the bodies had been pulled. Back down the soil, still loose, the opening not yet fully closed, and he stepped into it without hesitation, his boots sinking slightly as the ground gave way beneath him, and the darkness below swallowed the last of the light from above. The air changed immediately, thicker, colder, carrying the smell of damp earth and something else beneath it, something that lingered longer, something that had no place in living soil. And he descended carefully, one hand against the wall of packed dirt, the other holding the blade low as the narrow passage sloped downward, not steep enough to fall, but enough to pull him deeper with each step, and the space around him tightened quickly. The walls close enough to brush his shoulders, the ceiling low enough that he had to lower his stance to move, and the sound of movement came again from ahead, now clearer, no longer distant. A slow dragging scrape, followed by a hollow shifting noise, as if something large pressed against the walls from within. And Ronan slowed his steps, his breathing steady, despite the weight of the space around him, because this was where the fight would be decided. Not above, not where there was room to move, but here, where every motion would matter more. The passage widened slightly ahead, opening into a low chamber carved not by tools, but by repeated movement. The walls uneven, the ground churned by something that had passed through it again and again, and what he saw there stopped him for a fraction of a second, not from hesitation, but from the scale of it. The bodies were not scattered, not discarded. They were arranged, stacked in layers along the walls and ceiling, fused together in ways that should not have held arms, pressed into torsos, legs bent and locked into place, forming support where the earth alone could not hold, and through it all ran narrow tunnels branching outward in every direction, connecting the chamber to the rest of the ground, above and below, and at the center of it. Something moved, not rising, not striking, but shifting, slowly, as if adjusting its own weight within the structure, and Ronan's eyes narrowed, because now he understood this was not a creature that lived in tunnels. The tunnels were part of it, built from what it had taken, reinforced by the bodies it had consumed, and whatever lay at the center was what held it all together. The movement stopped. Then for a moment the chamber going still, as if it had felt him, as if it had become aware of something new within its reach. And then the walls shifted, not collapsing, but tightening. The bodies pressed into them, moving slightly, the limbs grinding against each other as the tunnels narrowed by a fraction. And the sound came again, not from ahead, not from behind, but from everywhere at once, a low, hollow vibration that ran through the structure itself. And Ronan stepped forward, because waiting here would only give it time to close around him, to trap him in a space that would not allow him to move at all. And the moment he did, the first of them dropped from the wall above a body, breaking free from the structure. its limbs snapping into motion as it hit the ground and lunged toward him. And Ronan cut it down in a single strike, the blade splitting it apart before it could fully stabilize. But even as it fell, another followed, then another, each one separating from the walls and ceiling and forming into something that could move, something that could attack. And he moved through them, not retreating, not allowing them to surround him because there was no space for that. Here, each strike, precise, each step controlled the bodies falling apart when he cut them. But the chamber itself continued to shift, more shapes forming from it, more pieces breaking away, and the realization settled deeper. This was not a series of creatures. This was one structure, one body that could divide itself into parts and attack from multiple directions, while the core remained hidden, somewhere deeper within the mass. A larger movement came then from the center, the ground rising slightly as something beneath it pushed upward and the bodies around it tightened, drawing inward as if making space, and Ronan saw it for a moment. A shape forming beneath the surface of the chamber. Not fully visible, not separate from the rest, but distinct enough to matter, a denser mass, where the bodies were packed tighter, where the movement originated. And that was the truth. Not the limbs, not the constructs, not the tunnels, but that core, the part that directed everything that moved, everything that rose, everything that fed. And if that could be reached, if that could be destroyed, the rest would collapse. The chamber shifted again, then more violently this time, the walls pressing inward, the tunnels narrowing further, as if the structure itself reacted to the threat he posed, and Ronan stepped forward again, forcing the distance closed before it could seal him in completely. His blade cutting through another body that dropped in front of him, the remains falling away as he pushed toward the center, because there would be no second chance here, no room to retreat, no space to recover. If he failed, the ground itself would close around him, and he would become part of it. Another piece in the structure, another body used to hold it together. And as the movement beneath the surface grew stronger, the shape forming more clearly, Ronan Vorn prepared to strike, not at what he could see, but at what held it all together, because anything less would not end this. It would only delay it, and delay meant more bodies, more graves, more ground. That did not stay closed for long. Ronan did not slow as the chamber tightened around him, because slowing meant being swallowed by it. The walls already shifting, the bodies grinding against each other as the tunnels narrowed further. The space closing with deliberate pressure, as if the entire structure had turned against him, and he stepped forward into it, instead forcing the distance toward the center before it could seal completely, his blade cutting through another form that dropped from above. The body splitting apart as it hit the ground, but even as it fell, the surrounding mass adjusted, closing the gap it left behind, and that confirmed it. Nothing here was wasted. Nothing here remained separate for long. Everything fed back into the structure. Everything served the same purpose, and the deeper he moved, the stronger that purpose became. The ground beneath him shifted, then rising slightly, as something below pushed upward, not breaking through yet, but gathering itself. And Ronan adjusted his stance, lowering his center of gravity as he moved closer, because this was the point where it would strike, where the core would reveal enough of itself to act directly, rather than through the pieces it controlled. And the first sign came not as movement but as pressure, a low force pushing outward from beneath the surface, distorting the shape of the chamber as the bodies embedded in the walls pulled tighter around it, making space for what was coming. And then it broke through, not cleanly, not in a single form, but as a mass forcing its way up through the ground, a dense knot of fused bodies packed together so tightly that they no longer resembled anything human. The limbs indistinguishable from each other, the faces collapsed into the structure, the entire shape moving as one as it rose, and the sound that came with it was not a roar, not a cry, but a deep grinding vibration that ran through the chamber itself. And Ronan stepped in immediately, because waiting would only give it time to stabilize, to pull more of itself into that central mass. And he drove his blade forward into it, the steel cutting through the outer layer with resistance that felt like packed bone and earth combined, and the mass reacted instantly, the surface shifting inward around the blade, as if trying to absorb it, to trap it within. And Ronan twisted hard, forcing the edge deeper, before ripping it free and stepping back as the mass surged upward again, expanding slightly, as more of the structure fed into it, the surrounding. Bodies collapsing inward as if drawn by that central force, and he saw it. Then the difference within the mass, not a shape, not a clear form, but a point where the movement originated, where the pressure came from a denser section that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. And that was the core, not separate, not exposed, but present enough to be reached. If he forced a path to it, the chamber tightened again, then the walls pressing inward, harder. Now the tunnels narrowing to the point where escape would no longer be possible, and Ronan did not retreat. He stepped forward again, closing the distance as the mass rose higher. Its movement stronger, its structure more stable with each second, and the bodies along the walls began to break free again. Not in small numbers this time, but in waves dropping into the chamber, to intercept him, to slow him, to hold him in place, long enough for the core to finish what it had started. And he moved through them without hesitation, his blade cutting in tight controlled motions, each strike creating just enough space to advance another step, the bodies falling apart around him. But the mass continued to grow, continued to rise, and the air grew heavier with each movement, the pressure building, as if the chamber itself would collapse inward at any moment. And Ronan forced himself closer, because there would be no second chance, no way to return. Once the space closed completely, he stepped onto the edge of the central mass, then his footing shifting as the surface moved beneath him, and he drove the blade down with everything he had, aiming not for the outer layer, but for that pulsing point within. And the steel struck resistance again, stronger this time, pushing back as if the structure itself resisted the intrusion. And he did not pull back. He forced it deeper, twisting hard, driving through the layers until he felt it. The change, the moment. The resistance gave slightly, and the mass reacted violently, the entire chamber convulsing, the walls shifting unevenly, the bodies losing alignment as the connection faltered, and Ronan held the blade there for a single heartbeat longer before twisting again. And this time, something broke. Not on the surface, not in the outer structure, but within the core itself. The pulse collapsing, the movement stuttering, and the reaction spread outward instantly. The mass losing cohesion, the bodies that formed it, separating where they had been forced together. the structure failing from the center outward, and Ronan ripped the blade free, stepping back as the chamber began to collapse the walls, no longer holding their shape, the tunnels caving in as the support gave way. And he turned immediately, moving back toward the opening he had come through. As the ground shifted beneath him, the space closing faster, now uncontrolled rather than deliberate, the bodies falling away into the earth as the structure lost the force that had held it together. And he climbed without stopping his hands, finding purchase in the loose soil. As it gave way around him, the darkness pressing in as the chamber behind him collapsed fully. And when he broke through the surface, the air hit him, sharp and cold. As the cemetery above shifted violently, the ground sinking in, places the graves collapsing inward as the tunnels beneath them gave way, and Ronan rolled clear of the opening as the earth settled again, the movement slowing, then stopping entirely. The silence that followed, different from before, not waiting, not occupied, just still the way it should have been. And he lay there for a moment longer, his breathing steady, despite the weight of what had just ended, because he needed to be certain, needed to feel, if anything still moved beneath the surface. But there was nothing, no scraping, no shifting, no sign that anything remained. And slowly he rose to his feet, his gaze moving across the cemetery, where the disturbed ground had begun to settle the graves, no longer shifting the soil, no longer rising, and Ronan Vorn turned away from it without looking back, because whatever had lived beneath this place, whatever had taken the dead and turned them into something else, had been broken at its source. And for now, that was enough. The earth would hold again, the graves would stay closed, and the silence would remain, until something else came along to disturb it again. Somewhere else where the ground was not yet broken, and no one knew what waited beneath it.